I remember the Christmas when Enderby found its song again. Enderby is not a big place. It's a little town tucked into a bend of river and field, with a brick bridge that everyone in town swears is older than it looks, and an old clock tower that rises above the rooftops like a finger pointing to the sky. I've been flying over Enderby for a very long time. I know where the bakery used to burn its first batch of bread every December. I know which chimney always sends up smoke a little crooked. I know how the river looks when the moon lays a silver path on its back. For years, Enderby was easy to spot from my sleigh on Christmas Eve. The tower clock would glow gold, and its bells would ring out the hour and the carols, carrying across the fields and into the dark. Children would listen for it under their blankets, counting the chimes until they were sure it was late enough for me to be on my way. But the year of the Christmas surprise, the town was different. It had been a hard year. I had watched it from above, how the factory by the river had finally closed its doors, its tall chimney no longer breathing out steam. I had seen families packing their things into small cars, driving away to look for work elsewhere. I had watched shopkeepers in the high street stand in their doorways, staring at the "To Let" sign in the whitewashed window next door and wondering if they were next. That autumn, the council decided the old clock tower was too expensive to maintain. The great bell mechanism had broken the year before, and the repairs cost more than the town could spare. So one day, men with ropes and tools climbed the narrow stairway, and when they came down again, the hands on the clock were frozen at 10 minutes past 2. The bells were silent. From that night on, when I flew over Enderby on my early winter loops, the town looked smaller somehow. Without its ringing voice, it was just another scatter of houses in the dark. And yet, something kept tugging my attention back to that place. As December drew near, the people of Enderby tried, each in their own way, to pretend that nothing had changed. They strung lights across shop windows, though a few more storefronts stayed dark. They planted the big fir tree in the square, as they did every year, though the decorations were a bit older and the tinsel a bit thinner. The school children practiced their carols in the chilly assembly hall, their breath puffing in the cold air because the radiators didn't quite keep up. But underneath it all, everyone felt the missing note. "It doesn't sound like Christmas without the bells," they would say, then fall quiet. Of all the hearts that felt that emptiness, one belonged to a boy named Jonah. He lived in a small terraced house on Mill Lane, with a narrow patch of garden out front and a low wall he'd chipped with his bicycle more than once. His father had been one of the men from the factory, and though he found odd jobs to keep them going, he carried the silence of that shuttered building around with him like a heavy coat. Jonah noticed. Children notice more than people think. On the first day of December, Jonah walked home from school with his scarf wrapped twice around his neck and his satchel banging against his knee. He passed the base of the clock tower and looked up at the frozen face, its hands forever stuck in the afternoon. He remembered how, when he was younger, his father used to lift him up on his shoulders on Christmas Eve so he could see the great bronze bell through the louvered slats. He remembered the way the town would pause when the first notes of a carol rang out from above. Shoppers stopping in the street, bus drivers leaning their heads out of windows to listen, neighbors opening their doors for the sound. Now, there was only the wind, rattling an old poster half torn from the notice board. That night, as the wind pushed against his bedroom window and the rest of the house settled into sleep, Jonah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. It's like someone turned down the volume of Christmas, he thought. Sometimes, at moments like that, when a thought is honest and clear, I am able to lean a little closer. What would you do, I wondered quietly in his heart, if you could change it? He turned over, frowned at the dark, and then sat up suddenly in bed. "You fix it," he whispered to himself. "If something's broken, you fix it." The next morning, instead of racing out to kick at the first skin of ice, in the puddles with the others, Jonah stopped at the base of the clock tower. He craned his neck, looking up at the high, silent windows. "How hard can it be?" he muttered. As it turned out, very hard. The tower belonged to the council, The mechanism was complicated. The permission to touch it was buried in papers and meetings and words like liability and budget. But Enderby was a small town, and small towns have cracks where big rules don't quite fit. Jonah's first ally was Mrs. Webb, the school secretary. She was the sort of woman who knew exactly where every key lived and when every meeting was held. She had bright eyes and a stack of tins full of biscuits that she refilled like clockwork. Mrs. Webb, Jonah asked at break time, hovering by her desk. "Who looks after the tower now?" "No one, dear," she replied, checking a list. "They left it up when they stopped the bell." "Why?" He shifted his weight. "If someone wanted to see it," he asked. Just to look. Who would they ask?" She glanced up at him, and I saw the moment she recognized the particular stubbornness in his expression. It was a look she'd seen on the faces of many children in that town. The same face, in a way, at different ages and heights. Enderby's own brand of quiet determination. "You'd ask Counselor Harris," she said at last. "He has the key. He comes in on Tuesdays to complain about the state of the photocopier." "Thank you," Jonah said, already turning away. He caught the counselor leaving the staff room that afternoon, a man in a worn suit with a thick folder under his arm. "Sir," Jonah asked, "do you still have the key to the clock tower?" Harris looked down at him in surprise. "Yes," he said slowly. "Why?" "I want to fix it," Jonah said. The counselor blinked once, then twice. "Fix it?" he repeated. "The mechanism is wrecked. It'd cost thousands. We've had engineers look at it." "Could I just see it?" Jonah asked. "Please, I won't touch anything." The man hesitated. The folder under his arm held, among other things, a report about the tower repairs stamped with numbers and costs and a red word. Impossible. But here was a boy, in a school jumper 2 inches too short at the wrist, asking to see inside. Sometimes adults forget that hope doesn't always wear a sensible shirt. "Come on then," Harris said, a little gruffly. "Before I change my mind." The tower smelled of dust and cold stone. Their footsteps echoed as they climbed the narrow spiral stairs, past old graffiti and spider webs, and a little patch of ivy that had crept in through a crack years before. At the top, the counselor unlocked a heavy wooden door and pushed it open. The clock room was a forest of gears and rods and levers, some the size of dinner plates, others as small as a coin. The great bell hung above, silent, a dark shape against the higher slats. The air felt still, in that special way that old places can, as if time itself had been holding its breath. "See," Harris said, "beautiful, but beyond us." Jonah stepped forward, eyes wide. He saw the thick oil dried on some of the joints, the chain that hung slack from the bell hammer, the cracked leather on a fixed pulley. "Who built it?" he asked. "Man named Wilcox," the counselor said. "Master clockmaker, so they say. Dead for years. Only one who really understood it." Jonah thought for a moment. "Is there anyone else who understands clocks?" he asked. Harris shrugged. "Old Mr. Wilkes used to mend watches above the post office," he said. "Retired now. Hardly leaves the house. Why are we talking about this again?" "Because we need them," Jonah said simply. "The bells. For Christmas." When he left the tower that day, his hair scented faintly of dust and old oil. He had a plan. He didn't do it alone, of course. Children rarely do, even when the story revolves around them. He roped in his friend Lila, whose laugh could fill a room, and whose mother ran the bakery. He convinced the twins from the end of his road, who knew how to climb anything. He talked to Mrs. Webb again, to the music teacher, to anyone who had ever looked a little wistful when the silence of the tower pressed down on the town. They went to see Mr. Wilkes. He lived in a narrow brick house behind the post office, with curtains that hadn't been pulled back properly in months. His front room smelled of brass and old paper and the faint, metallic tang of watch springs. When Jonah knocked, it took a long time for footsteps to shuffle to the door. "What?" came a voice from the crack. "We're here about the clock," Jonah said. "The tower clock. We want it to ring for Christmas." The door opened a little wider. A man with a white beard and clouded eyes peered out at them. "They've shut that old thing down," he said. "Too dear to mend. I read the notice." "They said no one understood it," Lila added. But you meant watches and clocks, and everyone says you knew Mr. Wilcox." Something flickered behind the old man's eyes at the name. "I knew him," he said slowly. "Worked under him for years. Finer hands than mine, stubborn as a barn door. Used to say a town without a bell is like a sentence without a full stop." Jonah shifted. "Then you know how much it matters," he said quietly. "Could you at least look?" Mr. Wilkes hesitated, his fingers twitching. He had been a man of moving parts once, of tiny gears and careful adjustments. He had spent the last years watching the town retreat into its troubles, while his own world shrank to the size of his sitting room. "It's too much," he began. Then he looked at their faces, earnest, hopeful, the same mixture of worry and determination he'd seen on their parents years ago when they fought for a new school roof or a safer crossing at the bend in the road. "I'll look," he said. The next days were busy in a way Enderby hadn't felt in a long time. When school let out, children disappeared toward the tower. Leela's mother sent up bags of warm rolls wrapped in cloth. The twins carried up tools. Counselor Harris, now caught in the web of their purpose, fetched old diagrams from the town archives. Mr. Wilkes climbed the stairs slowly every morning, his breath short but his mind sharp. I watched them work whenever my route took me near that part of the world. I saw the old man's hands tremble at first on the cold metal, then steady as muscle memory returned. I saw Jonah fetch and carry, learning the names of parts and the sound of a mechanism that was older than his grandparents. I saw Lila sit cross-legged on the floor, writing down Mr. Wilkes's instructions in a little notebook. They had no money for new parts, so they cleaned and mended what they had. They polished shafts, replaced cracked leather with pieces cut from old belts, tightened bolts, oiled joints with careful drops. They argued over details, laughed when things went wrong, and more than once went home with oil on their faces without realizing it. On the afternoon of Christmas Eve, the sky over Enderby grew low and heavy. Snow began to fall, soft at first, and then in thick, decisive flakes. Lights flickered on in windows early, as the day darkened faster than anyone expected. The weather report on a radio in the bakery crackled with warnings of power cuts. In the tower, the little group stood around the heart of the clock. The mechanism was whole again. The weights were wound. The hammer rested against the side of the bell, ready. "If we did this right," Mr. Wilkes said, voice raspy, "she'll speak when she's meant to." "And if we didn't?" one of the twins asked. He smiled faintly. "Then we try again after Christmas. But I've a feeling about tonight." At the same moment, I was harnessing the last of the reindeer and patting their necks at the North Pole, ready for my long journey. The snow over Enderby was on my charts. The power line sagging near the northern farms was noted. I knew, before the first house there ever flickered, that the town would lose its electric light just after 9. But I also knew what was waiting in the dark. That evening, as I swept in over the hills toward Enderby, the town below me suddenly flicked from bright to dim. Street lamps blinked out, shop signs went dark. Only the glow of candles in a few houses pushed back the shadows. I saw children at windows, their faces lit from below by the golden pools of flame. I heard a rumble of surprise, and then a wave of rueful laughter and exasperated sighs. No power, people said, on Christmas Eve. In the square, where the big fir tree stood, the fairy lights went dead halfway through a carol. Singers faltered. Parents pulled coats tighter around their children. Counselor Harris, craning his neck, felt a familiar knot tighten in his chest. "Not this year," he muttered. Then Sophie, one of the older schoolgirls, began to sing again, purely on instinct. Her voice wavered at first, then found its strength. Others joined. The carol rose into the dark, unamplified, unadorned, just human voices in cold air. Up in the tower, Jonah stood with his hand hovering just above the release lever. Beside him, Mr. Wilkes watched the pendulum swing. "Wait for it," the old man whispered. My sleigh curved over the town, bells on the harness chiming softly. I brought the reindeer lower, as if drawing nearer to a story's turning page. When the clock's frozen hands would have shown 10, the repaired mechanism, for the first time in years, felt its way through the train of gears and dropped the hammer. The bell's note rolled out over Enderby like a deep breath finally released. It rang once, then twice, then the full pattern of the hour. People in the square stopped singing mid-verse, their mouths falling open. Those at home lifted their heads. Children who had never heard the bell except in their grandparents' stories stared at their parents in wonder. Then the melody began. It was not a perfect carol. The timing stumbled a little. One of the notes clanged slightly off true, but it was the tune they all knew, the one I had heard from my sleigh on so many past Christmases, the tower's own song. In the tower room, Jonah laughed out loud, the sound half astonished, half relieved. Lila grabbed his arm and bounced on her toes. Tears stood in Mr. Wilkes's eyes, catching the dim light. "Still has it in her," he whispered, patting the metal. Down below, in the square, someone began to sing along. Others joined, fitting their voices to the bell's rhythm. The big tree stood dark, except for the faint reflection of candles from nearby windows, but the air was full of sound. Parents caught their children up in their arms. Neighbors turned toward one another. In one narrow house on Mill Lane, Jonah's father stood at the open door, listening. The weight he'd been carrying all year shifted, just a little, as if something inside him had remembered how to breathe. From the sky, Enderby no longer looked like just another patch of darkness. It was a small circle of music in the cold world, a town ringing its own name into the night. I made my stops there, of course. I left toy trains and painted figures, books and puzzles, oranges and nuts in their stockings. I left a new set of fine tools on Mr. Wilkes's table, though he pretended not to know where they'd come from. I left a small brass bell ornament in Jonah's house, no bigger than his thumb, with a note that simply said, "Thank you for fixing what mattered." But the best gift anyone received in Enderby that year was one they had given themselves. You see, the surprise at Enderby was not that the power went out and the bell came back. It was that in a year when everything seemed to be shrinking, jobs, plans, hopes, a group of people decided that one thing, at least, would not be allowed to fade quietly away. It was that a boy looked at a broken tower and thought, "We can fix this," instead of, "Someone should have done something." Since then, whenever I fly over Enderby on Christmas Eve, I still listen for the bell. It doesn't always ring quite on time. It still misses a note now and then. Some years the tower needs a little more oil, a little more care. But it rings, and the town sings with it. And I think of them, and of you, and of all the small, stubborn ways people pull light and sound back into their own dark corners. So if this Christmas finds you missing something, a tradition gone quiet, a place that feels empty, remember the tower at Enderby and the people who climbed its stairs. Remember that sometimes the surprise we're waiting for is the one we make with our own hands, together. I will be out there as I always am, watching the lights and listening for the songs. And when I hear a note that shouldn't exist anymore, but does because someone cared enough to bring it back, I will smile and whisper into the winter sky, "Well done, Enderby, well done."